Hello, welcome everybody. Where we open this chapter on political identity, chapter six. You have should have read the chapter. I'm going to hopefully go and cover this chapter all in one lecture rather than my traditional method of breaking the lectures into parts one and two. So, with this lecture, we'll first discuss ethnic identity, national identity, citizenship and patriotism, then the origins and persistence of these topics, and finally we'll end with Nigeria's identity conflicts. When chapter seven lecture comes around, we'll pick up on the conversation of political attitudes and ideology. So, the two types of social identities that often structure society are ethnic and national identity. Social identities help answer the questions of who am I and are there one way in which people organize themselves in a broader society? So you should consider how you yourself interact and participate with those two terms in your own personal life and how they might be, in a broad sense, apply to your world. So the first thing that or one of the first things we should do is it's critical that we define ethnicity, which is a set of specific attributes and societal institutions that makes one group of people culturally different from others. It's often based on customs, language, religion, or other factors. It's descriptive, generally assigned at birth, and the fourth point is it's not inherently political, which might make it difficult for us to wrap our minds around. So, here are some details on the broad definition of ethnicity. While ethnicity is generally based on genealogy, it's important that we don't overestimate this biology component. Ethnic politics researchers sometimes use the term imagined communities to describe ethnic groups. The origins of ethnic group identities may be more based on myth than in reality. And with the frequency of group intermarriages, purity ideas are also generally myths, as genetic analysis shows little significant differences between ethnic, religious, or racial groups. To further some of these points, the distinction between one group and others can be very minor, especially to outsiders. So, at the same time, the belief in a shared ethnic heritage is very powerful. Research on civil wars by Elaine Denny and Barbara Walter find that if civil war begins, it's more likely to be initiated by an ethnic group than any other type of group. These first two examples highlight how much variation there is in classifying ethnicity. Both are interesting cases, mostly because Bosnia and Rwanda experienced extreme ethnic violence within the context of ethnic cleansing and genocide during the 1990s. The main cultural difference identifying Bosnia's ethnicities is religion. While there is no discernible biological, religious, or cultural practices that differentiate the Hutu from the Tutsis in Rwanda. It's a famous film. If you haven't watched it yet, you should definitely try to get it on Netflix or another streaming device. But Hotel Rwanda is a really good film that I would recommend. But let's get back to okay. So there's no films that I'm aware of for the case of Bosnia, although there are some good documentaries on the Bosnian case. Some scholars have pointed out that Rwanda's ethnicities are largely colonial constructs. If you've taken an IR course, so to actually fit into the international relations theory of constructivism. And so, because they're the Hutus and the Tutsis are born out of these colonial constructs, the original classification based on a family's wealth, it's basically looked at as the number of cattle that one family owns. So that's sort of interesting. All right, let's move on to national identity. Um, Moving from social to socio-political identities, a nation is defined as the following. Point number one, a sense of belonging to a nation. So this is where a group that desires self-government through an independent state and a belief in its political aspirations. Number two, often, this isn't always the case, but it's derived from ethnic identity, oftentimes. Point number three, inherently political. So very different than ethnicity, which is the opposite. There's no real political basis for ethnicity. And lastly, the basis for nationalism, pride in one's people and belief that they have a unique political identity. Okay. So we're still really in sort of the in the realm of aspirations here. So for the moment, we'll leave aside any practical political realities. In some cases, we have the idea that one of the groups we belong to is the one that is appropriate for us to be governed by. The people within the group share the idea that it's okay for them to be subject to a common set of rules based on that identity. So if we are Americans or Canadians, to give another example, we think it's appropriate for us to be subject to similar rules. We would think it's strange or inappropriate if outsiders swooped into our country and were starting to make the rules. So, who am I and who are we? That is, what is the group of people of which I am a member that ought to govern itself? And the answer to that question really becomes the definition of a nation. And national identity is the sense of belonging to a nation that is the identity or the basis of nationalism. Unlike, again, as a point I made earlier, unlike ethnicity, which can be politically neutral, national identity is an inherently political social identity. Desiring a state, after all, generally means that your group is engaging in activities to try to make this goal a reality. They can be peaceful, such as protesting or lobbying governments, or they can be violent. Nationalism it's oftentimes connected to populism, but it's a major motivator for several terrorist groups of civil war insurgents around the world. The idea of nationalism is connected to the idea of a nation. We want to be governed as a group by ourselves, but who counts as part of ourselves? We might want to consider whether our own nation, our own country, the United States, is a nation. In the United States, we call baseball the national pastime. We share certain cultural and historical values like liberty and equality. And we have attachments to shared cultural symbols like the national anthem and the US flag. But does that really represent a common pride and belief in a common destiny? It's kind of an open-ended question. But turning to other countries, we have a lot of different states around the world that have regionally concentrated national minorities that have aspired to statehood. Some of the most famous are the Scottish and Northern Irish Republicans. They're Catholics in the UK. Spain's Catalonian population, which caused quite a bit of an upheaval with their independence referendum. And then you have Turkey's Kurdish minority, which the Turks are also, the Kurds are found in Turkey. The Kurds are also a minority within northern Iraq. So not all nations seek their own state, but some are happy with regional autonomy and cultural rights within an existing multicultural state. India is a great example of this. With two official national languages, Hindu and English, 14 constitutionally recognized languages, and another 30 languages spoken by more than 1 million speakers, India has a high rate of diversity. Some groups have pushed for regional autonomy and even independence, the most famous being the mostly Muslim population of India's Kashmir region. Other nations, however, have chosen to seek self determination through India's federal structure, which grants regionally concentrated minorities considerable local governance powers. And so the picture seen here depicts police celebrating the creation of Telangana, India's newest federal state in 2014. This location of India's Telugu speaking minority has long had a strong regionally based national identity. A lot of times you can think of the sort of regionally based national identity too being akin to something like Texans in the United States. They have a unique set of cultural aspects that make them, I think, a little bit different than the rest of America. For one, they're always, claiming that they're threatening to secede from the Union, break away and become their own country, which we know isn't going to happen. But I'm reminded too of the French Canadians in Quebec who were also threatened the Canadian government in Ottawa, where the capital is, of wanting to break away from Canada. Again, not going to happen. Um, Another important point that I forgot to mention, let me just go back to this example of India. In addition to India's distinct ethnic and language identity is the complexity of religion, which at times has divided or moderated these other differences. The most dramatic flare ups in sectarian violence are often between the majority Hindu, which is about 81% of the roughly 81% of the population, and Muslim, 13% of the population communities. Most of this violence, including the Delhi riots in 2020, would be classified as anti minority violence, as the perpetrators were largely Hindus and the victims were overwhelmingly Muslim. So, next up, we have a discussion on citizenship and patriotism. Um, Here we have kind of a three-part definition of citizenship. It's an individual's relation to the state. The individual swears allegiance to the state. We can see that through our Pledge of Allegiance in the US, if you want to look at that as an example. And the state in turn provides certain benefits or rights. We could actually look at that as sort of a social contract. Um, Second point is purely political and thus more easily changed than ethnic identity or national identity. And lastly, the basis for patriotism is pride in one's state and citizenship. Okay. If ethnicity is a largely social identity and nation is a combination of social and political, then citizenship is a purely political identity. In addition, ethnic and national identities may be considered deep social identities. They seldom change and they're even passed down through generations. On the other hand, citizenship is a more shallow, malleable, kind of flexible one. Whereas obviously ethnicity is very rigid, it's stuck in place. You are who you are, in a sense. So it's nearly impossible to change your ethnicity. Citizenship, on the other hand, can be changed provided you follow the rules laid out by your new adopted society. There are strict guidelines for becoming citizens in other countries. It's kind of nice to be able to carry two passports if you have that ability. But we got to keep in mind that being a citizen does not necessarily make you patriotic. On a more interesting twist of the point that I've just made, new citizens can be intensely patriotic. One study by the Cato Institute found that in the United States, immigrant citizens were much more patriotic and more trusting of the US government than native born Americans. It's kind of a oxymoron to say native born Americans, but indigenous peoples, Native Americans, um, it's it's strange to say native born Americans, but that's how the Cato Institute described this study. Um, the bigger picture here, though, is that the key takeaway that I want you all to have is that although there is the identity you choose, it can often be more important than the one you were born into. So that's kind of the takeaway. Again, the identity you choose can often be more important than the one that you were born into. So, what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism? Let's go ahead and find out. Try to break this down with nationalism on the left and patriotism on the right. Got 3 bullet points for each area. But when nations and statehood overlap, nationalism and patriotism can as well. When there's a disconnect, nations that lack states or states comprised of multiple ethnic groups who are generally happy with their state, individuals may have one but not the other. The example of the Palestinians who they're seeking statehood, but they have more critical views of the Israeli state. They possess nationalism, but not patriotism. Americans, on the other hand, or in contrast, have an international reputation of being intensely patriotic. That's from the outside perspective. We can think of extremely patriotic parades. Maybe some of you have attended those in the past. If you go to Washington, D.C. on the 4th of July, like I did a few years ago, you definitely see a lot of patriotism taking place there with their parade. Their parade in Washington, D.C. on the 4th of July goes literally all day long, from 8 o'clock in the morning until when it gets dark and the sun sets, and you have fireworks shows all across the city. Um, our actual nationalism, though, is largely limited to fringe groups in U.S. society. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind here. Okay. Let's move on to ethnic identity, national identity, and citizenship, our origins and persistence. As I said, I promised we would be covering these things. Where do identities come from? Many identities emerge right alongside the modern state. They are increased commerce, urbanization, new forms of social interactions. State leaders often saw identity creation as a means of reinforcing their power. And of course, ethnic and national identities in turn transformed the state. So, other examples of nation states where the national group and the state are essentially the same might include Germany, Japan, or Yemen. We often think of France as the sort of prototype of a nation state, a country where a French nation defined by culture, language, food, and customs, and a French state, which is a political organization, are combined. But France has sought to ban the headscarf and burqa in public places, and that creates a great deal of tension with their large Arab community. In addition, Islamic fundamentalism is also on the rise, particularly among France's second generation immigrants, those who were born and raised in France. So sometimes one nation dominates two states, but they may still be considered divided. There may be one Korean nation, even though there are two Korean states. Okay, this is, born out of the Korean War, and there's a stalemate. It's actually still an ongoing war, technically speaking, but there is a stalemate, and the two nations are divided because of politics. But multinational states are countries with more than one nation, more than one politically defined identity group. So in the United Kingdom, there's a single state with more than one nation. People in Great Britain typically think of Scotland, Wales, and England as being separate nations under that are united under one common state. So in the developing world, many state borders were drawn to reflect colonial power or administration rather than population realities. And really, as a result, many developing states contain multiple nations. Nigeria, for example, has over 250 separate ethno-linguist groups. Um, and you could probably think of other examples of multinational states. I spent time in Kenya. I spent 6 months there years ago, and discovered that you have roughly 33 or 34 different tribes. I was placed in the police college. There was, at the time I was there was only one police college for the entire country. So the Kenyan government sort of had attempted to do what's called sort of what we think about in America as as having equality in terms of representation for for those um, for those different tribes. So the idea was to pull police officers to go to this academy in Kiganjo, small village that was near the equator, and try to get sort of as equal as possible representation from all of those different tribes because uh, they are all so very, very distinct and different in their own rights and their own customs. They have their own language, their own actually skin tone, um, different facial characteristics, and that sort of thing for different ethnicities. Although they all speak Bantu languages, which actually you can see just ever so slightly the second point on there for the ethno-linguistic groups. Those are in the dark green, the Bantu languages, for the most part. And then you have some of the more pastoral tribes that travel around Kenya. Well, they actually don't really have a board. They don't really have a country. The Maasai, that is, they roam all over Eastern Africa, in Tanzania, Malawi, um, and Uganda. And so these are interesting kind of considerations to take into account. Um, but let me get back to I was mentioning Nigeria has 250 separate ethno-linguistic groups, um, and the United States and Canada could both plausibly fit the definition, although that could be a subject of debate, of a multinational state. Palestinian and Kurdish struggles for statehood are frequently in the news. Um, and so those are also things to take a look at. Okay, the final distinction between country and nation is important. Nation is not a legal definition; rather, it's a descriptive kind of aspect about how people feel. So while some countries, such as Japan, claim to represent the will of one nation, few countries have such a clean matchup between nation and country, especially when considering modern migration patterns. So even countries that are dominated by one group are not necessarily a perfect matchup. Egypt is predominantly Arab, but it does possess a sizable, roughly 8% Christian minority. Population wise and politically, the Arabs dominate. Um, should have gone to this slide here when I was talking, but um, in terms of population and political aspects, the Arabs dominate Egyptian politics, but their Christian minority have played an influential role in Egypt's economy, even though they represent only 9 or 10% of the population. Okay. Um, so I want you all to consider a situation in which ethnic and national identities are different, and ethnic identities are more important to at least some people than our state identities. You might be able to think of a number of ethnic and national conflicts around the world, but one very famous one that would fit into both of these categories would be the troubles that Northern Ireland has faced. While it first emerged as a civil rights movement seeking to address discrimination against the Catholic community, experienced in regards to voting, jobs, housing, it quickly escalated into an insurgent conflict pitting the UK state, the Protestant loyalist militia, and the Catholic Republican militia against one another. So we think of the IRA in this context. It fits the definition of a national conflict because the Republican groups sought to have Northern Ireland rejoin the Republican of Ireland, while the Protestant groups sought to remain part of the UK. So it's important to remember that conflicts that are often seen as irreconcilable, even those that have gone on for centuries, can be de escalated while tensions remain between the Protestant and Catholic communities in Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement has gone a long way toward building that peace. And even though these conflicts can also re escalate, given how Good Friday and those agreements were tied in with the European Union membership in a number of ways, the UK vote to leave the EU, the Brexit stuff, leads some to worry that this conflict may ultimately reemerge. And these here views of ethnic and social conflict, these essentially correspond to sociological, political, and economic sources of conflict. Most recent political scholarship largely rejects societal only explanations, but does point out that conflict is more likely when ethnic identities align with political exclusion and or economic discrimination. So um, I went up to a little bit too far, but Nigeria, and we're just going to kind of highlight this case here for a moment. It's a very diverse country, right? I've mentioned they've got 250 different ethnic groups. So moving to another example of conflict, Nigeria has had a long history of civil conflict and the emergence of terrorist militant groups like Boko Haram have reflected this long-term pattern, persistent pattern that Nigeria has had to face. And it's also 250 different ethnic groups with 250 ethno-linguistic diversities and languages. The major groups tend to view politics and economics as a zero-sum game. So in other words, it's not an ever expanding pie. One group wins, others will lose. It's not the idea of a rising boat, or excuse me, a rising sea lifts all boats. So that's an unfortunate reality, is that a lot of these groups are looking at economics as zero sum. Lots of corruption in Nigeria. Ethnic favoritism has led to considerable resentment and hostilities against the central government, and Nigeria's extreme regional disparities in wealth have made matters worse, especially when there's a you know oil reserves that are being discovered in the Niger Delta. Um, and so this creates some situations where you may see in the news certain groups going in and actually breaking into some of these pipelines. It's a big problem, especially for the oil companies that are trying to drill there. They set up pipes to transport the oil, and then they have leaky pipes because people are busting holes in them to get out oil and extract that, steal that resource. And a lot of these pipes are in pretty remote places, and that just makes the cost of doing business very expensive. So this slide here sort of focuses on the later part of the lecture, but we're looking at how Nepal's new democratic constitution has been designed in order to try to prevent conflict from reemerging. So what they did was they transitioned from a monarchy, and Nepal's new constitution created 7 new provinces with regional legislatures. So it's way different than India. India is, as we know it, is just in terms of population, is the world's largest democracy, although it's a very messy democracy. But India has this federal system where it's symmetric. You know, it's got resistance from certain groups, certain regions, and those were not drawn based along ethnic lines. Numerous issues remain sort of highly contentious, including what to name these regions. And as of 2019, 4 of the 7 regions have lacked names. I imagine they've probably got names by now. But if we want to predict whether Nepal's constitutional reforms will successfully reduce conflict, we might want to look at past cases to have a comparison where they've tried to have a similar solution. In general, while it's not perfect, devolution and federalism may be a good option of last resort. Another aspect to consider is the world's newest country that came into existence a few years ago, and that would be South Sudan. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that border was drawn between Sudan and South Sudan, but Sudan used to be one massive country, sort of in central or north central Africa. And it was essentially, in conflict with one another. And there's some conflict going on there currently, a civil war and potentially some genocidal actions that are taking place. But by and large, Sudan was separated by religion. In the north, you had Muslim majorities, and in the south, you had Christians. South Sudan became a nation mostly comprised of Christians, and Sudan became the nation that it is today, with majorities of Muslims. So that's an interesting case, but there's been lots of conflict in that country before and after the new country of South Sudan emerged. So chapter 7 is coming up next. Stay tuned. That is going to do it for chapter 6, where we covered social identities.